Okay. So yeah, I think we'll make a start, and we can always admit people if more people join. But yeah, lots of you here, which is fantastic. So welcome everybody to the Manchester Art Gallery Climate Justice Group's second event, following one in February this year, where we introduced ourselves as a group. And if you couldn't make it to that one, a recording of it is available. So if you just go to the gallery's YouTube channel, you can find it there, Manchester Art Gallery YouTube channel. So do check that out if you haven't seen it already. I'm Claire, I'm a curator at Manchester Art Gallery, and I'm a member of the group. And I'm just going to give some very, very brief background and talk about our plans for this evening. And while I do that, I'm just going to share a nice picture for you to look at. So the group started in July 2020 online, and it's evolved since then and has brought in new membership through the networks of existing members. Members who are not already paid by the gallery are paid, unless they choose not to be, and we meet regularly, currently usually on Zoom, every 2 weeks, sometimes in person. The group's brought together a mix of gallery staff, artists and activists based in Manchester. Since we came together as a group, we've developed some agreed key areas that we feel are useful in understanding the concept of climate justice and also relate to how we operate as a group. And these 4 agreed areas are learning from history, shaping the future, scrutiny, and collective care. So together, we're rethinking how Gallery 6 at Manchester Art Gallery, currently themed on natural forces, can shift into a focus on climate justice from February 2022 onwards, using the gallery's publicly owned collection to encourage collective learning and action. We do also hope to use a second space at the gallery to continue this work from summer 2022 and expand and take over the place, including a meeting space as part of that. And hopefully we'll be able to share more about that at our next event, which we're planning for early spring. So the image on the screen shows some artist minutes by Clare Stringer, which were made during an in-person session we did a few weeks ago, looking at images of all the collection objects on our long list to try and narrow down what we're actually going to use, how and why. One image could never capture this whole process, but it's a pretty good visual representation of the way that we work together and some of the ideas that came from that meeting. So we're going to be changing a space at Manchester Art Gallery, but it won't be an exhibition in a traditional sense as a finished product. Changing the gallery feels like the start of something, because how the gallery is activated and used will be a longer term process involving, hopefully, lots of other people too. We do really welcome ideas, and we want sessions like this to help shape the gallery, the stories it tells, and how it's used in future. So we're focusing tonight on really on the learning from history bit of our thinking, because we discovered from the last event that we did that there was real interest in joining the dots between economic and colonial history and climate change and how we got to where we are. So hopefully from the presentations this evening, you'll get a sense of how people in the group and the collection are coming together to help us to understand these connections. Planned for this evening, to get things started, we're going to hear some presentations from some of the members of the group, and each speaker will then introduce the next person. We have a slight change to the speakers this evening. Unfortunately, Rabia Begum is unwell and is unable to make this event, but we're going to stick with 3 presentations, and it just gives us some space around those, and we can have some questions, comments after each presentation. So it gives us a little bit more time to do that. So we thought that's what we do, just to change things a little bit. So we're going to have some the presentations. Feel free to share questions, comments in the chat during the whole event, but we're also going to have some time for conversation in breakout groups, where people might feel more comfortable speaking in smaller groups. And we have a general question which is basically the title of the event. Where can a new climate justice gallery take us? That is the question that we thought we'd use as a starting point, if that's useful for the breakout rooms, but I'll put a reminder of that in the chat just beforehand as well. We are recording the event, but the recordings from each breakout group will not be shared publicly. We'll be recording the audio, and that will be used by the group to see what's talked about and how this could help shape the gallery and how it develops and how it's used. So as I say, please do use the chat if you have any thoughts or questions that you'd like to share with everyone, or any specific questions about the presentations. And hopefully we'll have time between the presentations for that, as well as trying to stick to time, stick to schedule, which we'll do our best to do. So I'm now going to hand over to Ana Lucía Cuevas, our newest member of the group. So Lucia, it's over to you. And I will stop sharing. And
okay.
I will start your...
That's it.
Okay. Shall I press play? Ready?
Shall I say just a few words before it starts? Okay, thank you, Claire. That was a great introduction. Well, as Claire said, my name is Ana Lucía Cuevas. I am the newest member, but at the moment I am in Costa Rica. Here, my mother lives here. She's quite elderly, so I'm visiting here. So I recorded my presentations because we don't know how the connection is going to be. So I leave you with it, and we can have a few questions and answers afterwards.
Hello, my name is Ana Lucía Cuevas, and I am the newest member of the Climate Justice Group. I live in Manchester, but today I am in Costa Rica, where I'm visiting my mother. I was born and grew up in Guatemala in Central America, just south of the USA. Guatemala is one of the countries situated in what is referred to as the Global South. Today, I would like to tell you the story of some events that marked my childhood and that portrayed, on the one hand, the indiscriminate exploitation of Guatemala's natural...
Sorry again.
In 1970, I was a small child. My father, who was a Democrat, was elected Chancellor of the National University. During his administration, a nickel mine began to operate in the north of Guatemala, in the surroundings of a beautiful lake called Izabal. At that time, the political influence of foreign investors was such that they suggested to the government that it approve a new mining law that was to be drafted by lawyers hired by the company, with the argument of stimulating investment in the country. The location of the mine was in an area that for centuries was populated by Quechis indigenous people. However, the military governments repeatedly refused to recognize the indigenous community's historical ownership of the land. Instead, they dispossessed them by granting legal rights in favor of foreign corporations. At the time, our country's government was led by Carlos Arana Osorio, well known in our history for being a bloody military dictator. He granted a 40-year-long concessions for the exploitation of an area of 410 square kilometers of land surrounding the lake. Lands rich in deposits of nickel, cobalt, iron, and chromium. Later, in the 1970s, the relationship between the mining company and subsequent governments was put under scrutiny. The National University, under my father's administration, created a commission to analyze the details and the legality of the original granting of the concession. The commission was chaired by Rafael Piedrasanta, then Dean of the Faculty of Economic Science of the university. The other members were Adolfo Mijangos, Julio Camey, and Alfonso Bauer, all of them impeccable professionals, lawyers and economists, and all very respected friends of my father. The government's response to the commission was almost immediate, leading directly to the ruthless assassination of two of my father's best friends, Adolfo Mijangos, who was confined to a wheelchair, and Julio Camey. The other two colleagues were both forced into exile. I vividly remember those days and the profound pain and fear that these events caused to the whole community. It was the beginning of the long and bloody history of the mine in Izabal, El Estor, in the north of Guatemala. In 1982, Exmival, the company that owned the mine, withdrew from the country. The closure of their mine operations was motivated by the view that their profits would suffer in the light of the government's intention to increase the percentage of its royalties from 1% to 5%. But the tension over the mining company was short-lived. The next stage in the struggles of the communities around El Estor returned in 2004, when a new Canadian company bought the shares of Exmival and began the process to renew the mining exploitation license for another 40 years. Nickel from Guatemala seems to be highly valued in the world. The mineral extracted from the mining project is described as one of the 10 richest and purest in the world. El Estor is a land and a community surrounding the wonderful Lake Izabal, and so it is particularly ironic that its population lacks clean drinking water. This situation continues and worsens even more today, since the availability of clean water is irregular and there is no specific schedule for its access by families in the various communities. This seriously affects their daily activities since, in times like these, it is vitally important to have water availability to maintain hygiene measures and thus avoid contagion by COVID-19. This has made life much more difficult for the local people living in these circumstances. Today, the mine is owned by Solvay, a Russian-Swiss company that is actively masked by offshore companies in the Mediterranean. This parent company, in addition to those in Guatemala, has operations in the Ukraine, Russia, Macedonia, Indonesia, and Papua New Guinea. In the light of their loss of many lives, of lands, their livelihoods, and local autonomy, the indigenous Quechis communities have launched a call to the national and international community to turn their gaze on the events at El Estor. They view their resistance and this struggle as existential. They are calling for international solidarity and support to seize the theft of their lands and the subsequent repression of their community leaders and activism. They fear it might soon be too late with the threat of the return to the bloody years of state terror, as happened in the 70s and 80s of the last century. It was then that the Guatemalan people were subject to one of the longest and most cruel periods of internal repression and genocide ever experienced in the Western Hemisphere and Central America in particular. Thank you again for listening.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you, Claire, for playing that. We have 5 minutes to, if someone wants to make a comment or ask me a question before we break into, before we get on into the next presenter.
Hannah, has a hand. Oh, and Chris, who'd like to go first? Hannah, would you like to go first? I think I saw your hand first.
I was only filling the silence. I want to know what happens to the nickel. Why do they value it so much that they're doing all those things?
Yeah, that's
do you know?
Yes, I do know. It's a very complex process. They take all the soil as it is, and they do process some of it, but not. They do like an initial process, and then they take it in containers to Ukraine or to where they are going to process it, and then they separate all the metals. And the nickel is particularly special because you can use it to do all sorts of modern, computers, phones. I think even iron they can do with that. So it's, yeah, that's why it's so precious.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps not quite worth all of the pain, huh?
Well, it's worth a lot of money, so they go over anything. And I didn't have enough time on my presentation to go to the extent of what the population is suffering, because they have, through years, they have been fighting for their rights. And also, but now combined with the pollution, they are polluting the lake, they are polluting the air, and so and the pollution travels. So in the place where the lake is, there are high winds. So all the pollution that the mine creates travels, and it contaminates other cities. Sometimes that's the only way that some other towns around it start to understand why the people. The local people are against it, because the contamination is not only there, but it travels with the air. So it's, in a way, it's terrible, but in a way it also makes communities far from there understand why they are protesting. Mm-hmm. And I also like to say that the reason why I choose this example is because it was very obviously, as you heard at the beginning, it was very close to my family history, because the people that were assassinated were very, very close friend of my father. So that, as a child, it sticks in your mind. And that is how it began 50 years ago. And it has been a non-stop struggle to against the mine. And for many years there hasn't been a lot of attention to it, but now that people start to understand what more about the environment, are starting to understand what is the dreadfulness of the whole thing. Chris, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you for sharing something which is obviously so emotional and close to you as well. But I've got two questions. The first is, apart from closing the mine down, are there actually ways of trying to turn back that pollution? Reduce the amount that's in the water and the effect of the wind. And the second question is what's the best way for us in this country to campaign against that particular company, to influence that particular company? Does it have shareholders here, and does it have offices here, and all those sorts of things? Thank you.
Thank you for to the first question. I don't actually know. I think there might be, because I do know of ways to clearing certain type of pollution. That one specifically, I don't know. And on the second one, I will post a link, so if you are interested in following the news about there, because we have found. Obviously, I live in Manchester, but I'm still very attached to Guatemala because of my history. And I am the witness that when there is pressure from the outside world, it does make a difference. So I will post a link so that you can follow the news of what's happening there. I personally find that the indigenous people there are so incredibly amazing, because you know, they risk their lives and with nothing, you know, and this is obviously a very long subject, because all these issues also cause people to have to move and to emigrate. So it's linked to the mass immigration to the USA, for example. But people don't know why people have to leave, and this is one of the reasons.
I have a question, Claire, if I may, or someone else ahead of me.
Yeah.
Sure, yeah. We'll move on, if that's okay, to the next presentation, but we obviously do want to give time for questions, because it's such a you know, fascinating topic for presentations. Yeah, please go ahead.
Well, first off, I'd like to honor all the ancestors of the lands where you are, all of you are, and the ancestors of the lands where I am. I am an indigenous Raramuri, and I want to thank Claire for hosting this, and the Manchester Gallery for hosting this, and Ana Lucía for this informative video. And I'd like to ask you, yes, Ana Lucía, have there been other movements in Guatemala to counter an external company at this scale? Have they been successful?
Yes, we have quite a few projects that have organized long resistance, and yes, we do have stories of success. There is one in particular which is called La Puya, is called, and it's again, you know, there are incredible stories of the whole community standing against the mine. This one in particular is a gold mine, and we actually we have been inside and see how they have been organizing themselves, and they have managed to stop the working of the mine. Or, you know, sometimes what they ask is at least to have a community consultation about the mine. So yes, there are other resistance which I feel personally that they are gathering strength, because as I say, the world is becoming more aware that it's not just a question, it doesn't affect just the local community, but the whole world. So yes.
Thank you, Ana Lucía.
Thank you for asking that question. Thank you for all the questions. I'm afraid we will have to move on to the next presentation, but I feel like we could do a whole event just about Lucia's presentation, actually. And this, important to say again that this is an ongoing process, that we will be able to revisit these themes and topics. So don't see this as a closing down of the subject at all. But we'll move on to Janet's presentation. Janet, are you ready to start?
Hi, yeah, just unmuting. Hello, everybody. I'm Janet Boston, curator of craft and design and at Manchester Art Gallery, and I'm responsible for the curation of the collections of ceramics and metalwork, glass and furniture. And this evening, I'm just going to focus on just one object from our ceramics collection, which we've selected for the Climate Justice Gallery. So I'm just going to share screen now and show you the object. Here we go. So as you can see, it's a dodo. It's a wall tile decorated with a dodo, and it's designed by the great 19th century ceramic designer William Friend de Morgan. He was born in 1839, and he died in 1917. And it's a 6-inch square tile. It was made in inches, so I'm saying 6 inches. But for those of us who prefer decimal, that's 15.4 centimetres square. And it features a dodo, which is a bird which is a symbol of extinction. It's painted in underglazed green against a backdrop of stylised grass on a tin glazed background, a white tin glazed background. The dodo, as you can see, is striding energetically to the left, and it's a rather cartoon-like figure with a plump breast, large feet, and tiny flightless wings. And it was a flightless bird, of course. Now, this tile was made early in De Morgan's ceramic career when he was decorating bought-in tile banks. He later on set up his own manufactory for tiles. And the tile was made between 1875 and 1880, which is about 35 years after it was finally accepted by the sort of scientific community that the dodo was extinct. And that was back in 1840 when the dodo was finally recognised as extinct. So De Morgan, it was a subject that he returned to several times, the dodo. He repeated the design in different poses and in different colourways. And he presented dodo tiles to his friend, Charles Dodgson, better known as Lewis Carroll, who was the author of the famous children's book, Alice in Wonderland. And Dodgson had the tiles made into a fireplace. And there was actually a dodo featured briefly in the book Alice in Wonderland as well. Now, De Morgan was an incredibly talented designer, and he was a contemporary associate and lifelong friend of the socialist designer William Morris. And De Morgan came from a progressive family. His mother, Sophia, was a campaigner for women's education, for women's suffrage, back, remember, you know, in the early Victorian era. And she was also involved in prison reform and was a part of Elizabeth Fry's circle and the campaign to reform prisons. His father, Augustus, was chair in mathematics and also a campaigner for women's education. So overall, quite a progressive family. So what about the dodo that De Morgan featured? Well, it had originally been discovered in Mauritius, an island east of Madagascar, in 1598, and it was unique to that island, found nowhere else. The last dodo was seen alive there in 1662, just 64 years after it was first discovered by Dutch sailors who landed on the island. And its extinction was not noticed at first and was repeatedly sort of dismissed as a myth until the 1840s. And does this kind of remind you, this denial in the face of evidence of kind of climate change deniers, you know, that people don't listen to the science? So De Morgan's illustration of the dodo was based on 17th century drawings, and about 20 of these were sort of available in the late 19th century. The only sort of actual remains of a dodo that existed at this time were a head and a foot in museum collections that were, and also some sub-fossilized partial skeletons. So there were no taxidermy specimens of dodos because the dodo, unfortunately, was long gone before taxidermy had ever been invented. So the dodo was a distant ancestor of the pigeon family, and we know from recent archaeological digs of dodo skeletons that many of the drawings of it were actually not anatomically accurate. And if we look at De Morgan's illustration, you can see that they made the birds look quite heavy and they exaggerated the size of the breastbone. And this may be partly because the dodo was, you know, sort of fattened up for slaughter by the sailors that encountered it, and due also to the 17th century fashion for making meat-bearing animals look plump. So why did the dodo become extinct? Well, it's thought that the dodo perished mainly because humans destroyed its habitat and introduced other species which competed with it for food, and which also killed the defenseless dodo chicks. Dodos only ever had like one egg, one baby, because there were no predators prior to the arrival of Europeans in 1598. It was an uninhabited island, and so there were no humans to kill it. There were no predators. The other cause of the dodo's demise was hunting by the sailors, although this wasn't thought to be the main cause of extinction, because dodo flesh was apparently rather tasteless and people quickly targeted other species of birds for meat on the island. Also, up until the 1660s, there were never more than 50 people living on the island at any time. So it's kind of salient that there wasn't a large population of people, and yet it was enough to completely mess up the delicate ecology of the island. And ironically, the island had been visited by Phoenician, East African and Arab ships since the 10th century. But these sailors did not settle there, they did not intervene, they did not meddle, they did not mess. And it was only when the Europeans arrived and basically took over the place and started exploiting it that the dodo was basically doomed. So the dodo, as I said at the beginning, is an iconic symbol of extinction and everybody recognises it. And it's been a subject of intense scientific interest ever since the 1840s. But I can't help reflecting that, sad as its extinction is, it's widely represented, and yet the indigenous peoples who have been decimated due to European colonisation, such as, for example, the island Arawak or Taino of the Caribbean, are much less discussed in sort of popular culture. And the Tainos died due to a combination of lack of resistance to European diseases, things like the common cold, but also due to the murderous behaviour of the Spanish colonists. And I'm sort of reflecting on the fact that kind of culture is kind of more inclined to focus on the demise of extinct animals than on the extinction of people, and that's kind of quite problematic, and we need to think about that. So what can we learn from history? Well, to avoid repeating the same mistake today, we need to preserve remaining wildernesses like the rainforests and keep them free of interventions like logging, farming and mining. And we also need to care about people, not just animals. And we need to support and listen to Indigenous peoples who live in harmony with their environments and are being displaced. And as Lucia talked about this evening, murdered by those who are wishing to exploit their ancestral territories. That's it.
Thank you, Janet. Would anyone like to ask any questions before we move to the next presentation? Marie, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you, Janet, for the thoughtful curating, having this piece curated for your gallery. Is this gallery going to be part of the display for climate justice on how the Manchester Gallery is going to support climate justice? Is that the piece, the focal piece that you chose?
It's one of the pieces that we've chosen, yes, and it represents, you know, kind of the theme of learning from history. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like that. And I was wondering, I'd like to take a few words from your presentation. And one of them was that the gallery's effort is, the gallery wants to support climate justice, this is what I heard, by supporting Indigenous people. So I'm curious if you've considered supporting Indigenous people by commissioning an Indigenous artist to convey from their perspective, from their heart, from their art, what climate justice means to them. And it might capture a broader audience. Have you considered that, Janet?
Yeah, we have started talking about the commissioning. Yes, we're at sort of very early tentative kind of stages of talking about it, but yes, and we have thought about exactly that. So yes.
Wonderful. And when is your launch? When is the opening of this climate justice gallery?
It's the 5th of February, but it's kind of what we call a soft opening, I guess, because although we will be putting all the things that we've selected out on display, we are going to continue to work and engage and build on the ideas with the people of Manchester. So it will grow and change. It won't be just a space we open and ta-da, it's done. So yeah.
And then finally, have you considered, so commissioning will take a while, it may take months, weeks to find an artist, commission them to get the product. How about a current Indigenous artist that already has an array of art in different forms, and having one of their or multiple pieces, or maybe even all the pieces from Indigenous people instead of colonizers or settlers or former colonizers? Have you considered that, Janet?
Yeah, well, the gallery is sort of representing our existing collections, because there is obviously, we have over 50,000 objects in our collection, and it is our kind of duty to show what we already have. But absolutely, we are committed to continuing to build that collection, and also to address, the existing biases and gaps in the collection, if you like, and yeah, to represent voices that are underrepresented in our collections at present. Yes.
Thank you, Janet. Thank you, everybody, for your time.
Thank you for your questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Janet. We will go to the next presentation, which is Jane. Are you ready, Jane?
I am ready. And also, just to follow on from your question, I mean, I just want to say really briefly, in curating the Climate Justice Gallery, we haven't had any budget for commissions or acquisitions. We've only we only can draw at the moment on the existing collection, but as part of the discussions we've been having within us, we have started to want to take a closer look at how the gallery commissions and acquisitions, in its whole, how that happens, and to bring some transparency to that. And there was something else I was going to say, but oh yes, and in terms of the gaps, and I think this is something that Ana Lucía was going to, we talked about touching on with her presentation, but when we came to select the works for the gallery, we found that there was a real massive lack of pieces by women of colour artists, and so there is a gap. There is a gap on one of the walls because of that, and we've put that gap there to highlight that particular problem, and I'm going to come back to that at the end of what I say. So my presentation, let me quickly get my share screen. Which sorry everyone, I've actually put it, I'm at the wrong bit of the presentation because I got so absorbed in everyone else's what they were saying that I forgot to actually get to the right place. Right, let's start again. So, as Claire said, we've had themes that we've been looking at for the collection, and what I'm going to do now for the gallery, rather, I'm going to track the development of the fossil fuel economy since the first object in the gallery was made, by doing a whistle-stop tour around the walls of what we plan to have in the gallery, and just focusing on a few of the pieces that we've chosen. Because I'm going around wall by wall, this is not going to be in chronological order, so there's going to be a bit of back and forth in history. So this first wall, it has a working title of King Canute, in that we're looking at the foolishness and the destructive human attempts to control non-human nature. And the first piece that I'd like to talk about is the oldest piece that will be in the Climate Justice Gallery, which is this oak chest, which was made sometime between 1600 and 1700. It's made with oak, it's inlaid with holly and bog oak. And 1600 is the year that the British East India Company was formed to trade in the Indian Ocean. And the East India Company goes on to establish the British presence in India ahead of the empire. It has its own army and it has its own fleet of ships. So in 1600, when the East India Company was established, the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is 276 parts per million. And 2 years after this, in 1602, the world's first stock exchange is established in Amsterdam to provide a secondary market in Dutch East India Company shares. So this is a hugely significant event in the development of capitalism. It's the first stock exchange, and both East India companies are hugely closely linked to the development of colonialism. I mean, they are set up to bring resources from the East Indies to Western Europe. And in classic tradition, although we relied on oak in England to provide timber for the Navy, that didn't stop us over-exploiting our woodlands. And we also, the demand for oak for the English Navy was also one of the factors in the destruction of forests in Ireland in Tudor times. And then slightly later on in the 17th century, in 1627, the last wild aurochs, which is the ancestor of the ox, that dies in Poland. And again, fairly typically, this extinction is caused by hunting, by loss of habitat due to the development of farming, and due to diseases transmitted by domesticated cattle. If we fast forward to when this chest was donated to Manchester Art Gallery in 1957, we're now at the beginning of the space age. So this is the year that the Soviet Union launches Sputnik as the first artificial Earth satellite. It is also the year of the International Geophysical Year, which is a project of international scientific cooperation, one legacy of which is the atmospheric carbon dioxide readings that started to be taken at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii from 1958 onwards. These readings were initiated and overseen for quite some time, several decades, by Charles Keeling. So you may be familiar with the Keeling curve, which is the graph of atmospheric carbon dioxide, which goes like that. So at this point in 1958, the level of atmospheric carbon dioxide is 316 parts per million. So if the chest was made in 1600, then carbon dioxide levels have increased by 40 parts per million in the time since the chest was made in 1600 and the time it's donated in 1957. So on to our next wall. This wall focuses on consumption and extraction. And I'm going to zero in on this comb, a copper comb thought to date from the 18th century, which was found, it was excavated when Holborn Viaduct road bridge was built in London in 1866. So the comb is from the 18th century. This is a really significant century in terms of climate change. In 1712, Thomas Newcomen has built the first steam engine for pumping water. It runs on coal, and among other things, it's used to control flooding in coal mines. So they burn coal in order to extract more coal, to burn more coal. Atmospheric carbon dioxide at this point in 1712 is 277 parts per million. Then again, during the 18th century, middle part of the 18th century, the large-scale enclosure of common lands starts in Britain. And by the time the comb is excavated in 1866, over 21% of the land in Britain has been enclosed, and people have lost the rights to graze animals on these lands. And this is one of the factors as well that, that pushes a lot of people into the cities, where they get to work in factories for the Industrial Revolution. So, middle of the 18th century, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is still around 277 parts per million. In 1769, James Watt, building on the work of Newcomen and other predecessors, patents his new improved steam engine. So it's now possible to pump water out of coal mines more efficiently and extract more coal. Carbon dioxide levels haven't changed much. They're still at 279 parts per million. By the time the comb is excavated, they have only gone up another 8 parts per million to 287. 4 years after the comb is excavated, in 1870, Standard Oil is established in the US. This company goes on to become Esso and then ExxonMobil. As ExxonMobil, it puts tens of millions of dollars into climate misinformation, along with the other oil companies. So the climate emergency, like Brexit, has been bought cheaply by these companies and actors. So this wall has a rough working title of Scrutiny and Solutions, and I would like to focus in on this ridged vessel by Clare Mallet. This is made in 2014 from a recycled steel can and responsibly sourced gold and copper leaf. This is, I mean, Janet, I think you know more about the sourcing of gold and copper, haven't you, and what the process Clare went into to do this. At the time, 2014 is the hottest year on record. It is now the 7th hottest year on record. In 2014, California entered its 3rd year of drought in its driest period for 400 years, and atmospheric carbon dioxide was 398 parts per million. Then going on to the 4th wall, this is what we call the forest school corner. This wall broadly focuses on well-being and nature. And I'm going to focus, these are 2 of 3 really beautiful engravings by Eric Fitch Dalgleish, made between 1925 and 1928. So by the time the first of these is made in 1925, the United States has overtaken the United Kingdom as the country that has emitted the largest total amount of carbon dioxide. So up until 1911, the UK has emitted the largest total amount of carbon dioxide. We're now 5th. Also during the time that Dalgleish is making these engravings, in 1927, the Turkish Petroleum Company discovers oil in Iraq. Its main shareholders are the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which goes on to become BP, Royal Dutch Shell, the company Française de Pétrole, which becomes Total, and the Near East Development Corporation, which is a consortium of 5 large US oil companies, among them our friends Standard Oil. In 1929, the Turkish Petroleum Company changes its name to the Iraq Petroleum Company. However, it has no Iraqi shareholders. In 1929, we're at 306 parts per million of atmospheric carbon dioxide. And then going back to our starting wall, in the middle of the wall, there is an empty space. And this is because there was, as a legacy of colonialism and patriarchy, there is a big gap in the art gallery's collection. There is very little works. There are very few works by women of colour, and there weren't any that we felt were right for this gallery. But another area in which women have been overlooked. Sorry, another area. I'm phrased that really badly. Anyway, female scientists have been overlooked, and the first scientist known to have experimented on the warming effect of sunlight on different gases and to have theorized that changing the proportion of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will change its temperature is a scientist called Eunice Foote, who presents a paper about this at the American Association for the Advancement of Science conference in 1856, before John Tyndall presents very similar calculations about 3 years later. So when she presents that, when she publishes that paper, we're at 286 parts per million. And then bringing us back to where we started with the oak chest. Above this, we have Scene on the Shore at Scheveningen by Isa Costada, made in about the 1640s, this larger painting, and then much smaller. This is a postcard. This is called Scene on the Shore at Scheveningen after Isaac von Ostade. This is an artist called J. Redman, who has taken a postcard from the Manchester Art Gallery shop, and he has painted an elevated sea level on it. He made this in 2015, which again, at the time was the hottest year on record. It's now the 4th hottest year. And in this year, we have markedly more severe extreme weather events. Cyclone Pam hits Port Vila in Vanuatu at 340 kilometers per hour. In the Northern Hemisphere, we have wind speeds getting up to 112 kilometers per hour. We have the wettest December on record in the UK, widespread flooding. And at the COP21 negotiations in Paris, they set a goal of keeping temperature rise to 1.5 degrees. However, the Paris Agreement does not mention the words fossil fuels anywhere. And at this point, 2015 atmospheric carbon dioxide is now at 403 parts per million. So an increase between the earliest item in the gallery and the most recent of 127 parts per million in atmospheric carbon dioxide. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of the different walls of the gallery. I don't know if anyone's got any questions, any comments.
Looking for any hands up. Huge, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'm not going to say anything special, but I think that's a really rich way of taking us around and creating links between artworks and corporate development, if you can call it that, of oil and also the dysfunctionality of that entire process. So thanks, Jane, for that. I think that one thing, just in relation to the title of this event, one thing that as a member of the group that's helping to develop the gallery, one thing that I've struggled with, and I think we're all struggling with, is how to do justice, pardon the expression, to the subject using artworks. There's that many stories behind it. So I'd be really interested to hear any ideas of how, like the dodo, it's such a rich story behind it. We're looking at a tile with a picture of a bird on it. The range of things that Jane said, and I know that Jane's got a number of ideas. I mean, maybe you could say just a couple of words about, the statistics you're thinking about, possibly having those in, within the gallery in some form, but we're keen not to make a gallery something that you spend too much time reading in, because people don't like to go to an art gallery and spend a lot of time reading. So yeah, how do we do this? How does a gallery look using artwork from the art gallery's collection? Able to attract
the imagination of the general public. If it gets too technical, that becomes boring, but you attract the imagination and they may go back and want to look into it more.
Mm-hmm.
You're experts on it, I'm not. So if it gets too technical, I'll walk through it so fast I might miss the most important pieces or objects explaining. So it's interesting, it attracts my imagination and attention, then I'll stay there longer and I'll go back and have a much more interest in the subject. And that's how you want to interest other people that may not be thought about it.
Shall I just say briefly, one thing, thank you for clarifying what I meant when I was getting all in my words in a twist about talking about the gap. So just so when we're talking about the gap and that there aren't any women of colour artists in the gallery, that's a gap in the gallery's collection, not in the world. And what we've talked about, one thing we've talked about, and I agree, you know, we don't want to be overloading people with information. So one really simple thing we've thought of to do is to put the on the label for each artwork, the level of atmospheric carbon dioxide for the year when it was made. So that's just a figure, very simple. But we've also been wondering how we can also get across something about the colonial process that has been going on since 1600. And we've been looking for, again, a similarly simple indicator for that, which is an ambitious thing to be looking for, something where we can express that flow of wealth from the majority world to the global north that's been going on since from 1600 up till now. So if anyone has any suggestions for that, we'd be really interested in hearing them.
Yeah, and perhaps something we could also follow up on in other ways, give people a chance to think about it and perhaps follow up a future event. We can draw out threads from this event that people obviously are interested in so that we can follow up later and have further discussions about. That would be really positive, I think.
Jane, excuse me, I was in the middle of typing something. Can you repeat what type of feedback you were looking for on what specific area, in what specific area? I missed that, I apologize.
So we would really like to have something on the label for each artwork that indicates the history of the flow of wealth from the majority world to the global north. That can be like in a simple figure, similarly to how we can express atmospheric carbon dioxide levels by just having a very simple figure of parts per million. And so, you know, there are various possibilities, but so far there's nothing in the way we've got data from 1600 to the present day. So maybe levels of global debt, proportion of wealth held in different parts of the world, that kind of figure. I've got a lot of articles to read through to try and delve around and find this.
Yeah, it seems like any figure would be fine as long as you standardize it across the way and then use a visual, either a pie or a bubble that shows the comparison between the larger amount and that individual amount. And that would be a quick depiction of the contrast and the progress as you walk around the room.
Yeah, I mean, if we can, yeah, if we have the data, but yeah. That is the kind of thing we're looking for, though, definitely.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's been, all of the contributions have been really, really useful and really interesting. We're going to have another session of similar to this sometime in early spring, I think. I'm not sure. We haven't got an exact date yet, but it'll be kind of early spring, whatever that means. The gallery opens on the 5th of February. There's not a hard launch of any kind, but I hope you'll all be able to come and have a look at it and give us feedback. I think we'd really like feedback. Just one very quick thing before we go. I noticed that a certain number of people left around 7:30-ish, and we did wonder whether this session should have been 6 to 7:30, and then we decided 6:30 to 8 because we thought some people might need a bit of time after 6 o'clock if they're leaving work. If everybody can just stick in the in the chat whether just write down 6 or 6:30 as to what you would prefer personally. It might just be useful for us to know. So literally just stick in the chat 6 or 6:30 as to what you prefer, and then we might have a kind of a very quick poll as to what time to start next time. The other thing, probably this is the most obvious thing to say, but simply having artwork in a gallery titled Climate Justice is a bit of a statement in a way. It took the group a little bit of time, to not too long, to decide to call ourselves Climate Justice, not simply climate change or whatever. The idea that climate justice, the issue has been around for a lot longer before people have started talking about it, and then seeing artworks through history, as Jane has talked about, and realizing that there's so much artwork that have unbeknownst to us up until recently, have actually got climate relevance, and always have had, except we've not really understood it until now. So in a way, implicitly, that's what we're doing, whatever we do. So I think there is, as a concept, it's got legs, as it were. Anyway, thank you very much for coming, and I really hope to see you again for the next event early next year. Bye.